Hello, everyone. As chair of the Community for Human Animal Studies Israel, I'm very excited to start off our 5th annual conference, which is also our first international and virtual one. The last year and a half have brought with them many challenges and tribulations. In many countries, these hardships remain considerable. These difficult times have also opened new opportunities. An example, small as it may be in the grander scheme of things, is the possibility to open up our yearly gatherings to a much larger and diverse audience. We were thrilled to receive so many stimulating abstracts and overjoyed that so many scholars whose work we have appreciated and admired for years were interested in participating. COVID times have had a significant impact on multi-species relations as well, on human and non-human animals, and on the environment and the world we live in. And they raise the need for a renewed discussion of multi-species models of knowledge production. Perhaps we should reconsider the ways we conduct multi-species research in gender-human-animal relations, or think about them. Can and should we utilize our work to affect, perhaps improve, the reality of our lives? How might we think about new ways to create collaborations between various scholars, disciplines, countries, species? These have always been pertinent questions in our field of study, but they're becoming even more urgent during these times. This conference brings together researchers and intellectuals who are committed to explore these and other issues. Each of the 3 days of the conference focuses on a different theme. Today, we will begin with multi-species challenges. Tomorrow will be somewhat more optimistic as we explore opportunities. And the last day will open exhilarating and innovative possibilities for conversation. Before we continue with the rest of our planned schedule, I find it impossible to hold a conference under the auspices of the Israeli Anthropological Association and Tel-Aviv University and not address what has been going on in Israel and Palestine over the last few weeks. Although Palestinians and Israelis are sadly very accustomed to such violent flare-ups, I was personally horrified by the ever-rising levels of hatred and hostility, and my heart clenches thinking of the consequences of this conflict. I hope that finding opportunities for dialogue and communication will lead us towards a route of just and peaceful relations. And now, let us turn to Professor Omri Yadlin, Director of Tel Aviv University's Law Clinics Program.
Thank you, Dafna. On behalf of the Koller and Mon Animal Rights and Welfare Program, I'm delighted to open this international conference on human-animal relations. The Koller and Mon program at Tel Aviv University Law School started its operation about 3 years ago. Our goal is to advance the human understanding of and compassion for animals. In addition to academic courses on this topic, in addition to the promotion of multidisciplinary research in this field, in addition to the human-animal student club we operate, at least as long as the COVID and the missile threats are removed, in addition to all these activities, we also operate an animal rights law clinic. The clinic has become a significant and influential factor in advocacy for animal rights and welfare in Israel, working on a range of cases, from a case that aims to protect the well-being of one animal to a case in which we fight for the rights of the unprivileged all people to hold on to their pets, and to a case in which we strive to change a whole industry. For example, the clinic's efforts to end the intensive confinement of hens in the egg industry have recently led to the Israeli Ministers of Agriculture to adopt regulation that supports a transition to a cage-free production. At the same time, the clinic will soon file a petition in collaboration with the Non-Human Rights Project for the acknowledgement of fundamental rights for animals in Israel. Our collaboration in the organization of this conference is certainly an additional highlight of our program, and we certainly hope it will open the door for collaboration with similar academic organizations in the world, and hopefully also with our neighbors across the fence. I thank you all for attending. The program of this conference is fascinating, so let's start. With no further ado, I pass the torch back to Dafna to present today's keynote speaker. Dafna, please.
Thank you, Omri. I would like to use this opportunity to thank the Law Clinics program, which is part of the Color Amendment Animals Rights and Welfare Program, was kind enough to sponsor this conference and help it come to fruition. I would also like to thank the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies for hosting us here at Hebrew University. Our conference chair, Anat Ben Yonatan, co-chair Limor Chen, and the rest of the fantastic organizing committee, thank you all. And I am now thrilled to present our keynote speaker, Professor Barbara J. King. Professor King is an anthropologist, science writer, and an expert on animal cognition and emotion. Her work has influenced mine and many others over the years as she expanded our understanding of the ever-evolving relations between humans and other animals, as well as the inner lives of animals. Her 2013 book, How Animals Grieve, is an incredible window into the rich emotional life of animals and was deemed one of the 50 must-read science nature books. Her latest book, just out, go out and buy it, Animals' Best Friends, Putting Compassion to Work for Animals in Captivity and in the Wild, is a captivating read that deals with the challenges that arise as we come to realize the complexities of animals' feelings and thoughts, but also the opportunities that can unfold. She illustrates the connection between knowledge and action and the importance of compassion. So we will now turn to Professor King, and you are all welcome to jot down your thoughts and questions in the chat box during her talk, and we will return to them in the discussion. So, Barbara, are you here with us? Yes.
Yes, I am. Thank you so much, Dafna, for a generous introduction. I'd like to thank also all the event organizers who have worked so hard to put together a 3-day program that looks really exciting and stimulating, and I will enjoy listening in. I am here in the US in Virginia, where it is a little after 10 o'clock in the morning. So I greet you in all locations and all time zones. And I look forward very much to this next hour or so. What I thought I would do today is talk about some of the themes of the conference in a frame of enacting compassion for animals. So we know that some of the themes involve challenges, opportunities, trans-species entanglements. What I have been working on for the last decade or so is not only animal cognition and emotion, but how do we challenge ourselves and each other to not just work on animals, but to work for animals. And I am attempting to speak across communities. I think that it's important to speak within and also outside of academic communities. So this talk is pitched not at a necessarily only an academic audience, but a broad audience. And I think what I'll do now is share screen and start some slides, which I will go to slideshow from the beginning. Okay, I am assuming you can all see that well, my slides? Okay, alrighty. I've been thinking about this question of how we all can enact compassion. And of course, the question is, who is the we that I'm talking to? And I've addressed that a little bit already, but part of the work I do is to challenge myself to think about how every day there are opportunities all around me to see the animals that are around us beyond just my so-called subjects. And I've been thinking in 5 different contexts. One of them is animals at home. And I mention this because we have 6 rescued cats in the part of the house where I'm doing this talk. So anything could happen. If you see rescued animals wandering around, you'll know why. Animals in the home is context number 1. Animals in the wild, I also am working on. This is a slide from my dissertation site in Kenya. And also, of course, animals in the wild are all around us, including if we live in a yard, if we have an apartment balcony, if we are on campus or a corporate campus. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is that question of the wild. I'm very interested in language, and I'll be bringing up through this talk how the language that we adopt affects the questions that we ask and the answers that we seek. And I've come to work on a small project where I live, as I mentioned, in Virginia, of just thinking about the wild being all around me. So in our yard, we have native box turtles, native groundhogs, red-headed woodpecker on the left and a sharp-shinned hawk on the right, a black racer in our bushes. So the border between the home and the wild is, of course, porous and very contested. I speak about animals in captive situations, specifically in zoos, in laboratories, and as food, as the last of the 5 contexts that I'm talking about. And I will touch on each of these today, but to varying degrees because, of course, of time constraints. So with the idea of a call to action, it is interesting to consider how an anthropological view and an activist's view sometimes pull in the same direction and sometimes pull in different directions. And this is part of the challenge. And it is important to think not prescriptively, but to invite everyone to think about compassion according to their circumstance and their ability. And we will talk about that as well. So that I want to think about the harms to animals that occur in our world as things that we need to look at, but also that can be considered opportunities for us. So there are 3 A's that I think about in terms of my approach to animal studies. And one, of course, is being an anthropologist. For years, we have many anthropologists who are writing and thinking about the more than human world. But perhaps some of you know the book, How Forests Think by Eduardo Kohn. And this is where the entire perspective really came home to me and came vividly alive for me. When Kohn writes, the world beyond the human is not a meaningless one made meaningful by humans, I see that as a grounding principle of a way to look at the world and a way to think about the questions that this conference is centered around. And often when I do this, the scientific community responds in several ways. And there is, of course, embrace of this view, but there's also pushback from scientists who tell me that if I think that way, I'm simply projecting human qualities onto other animals, which is, of course, anthropomorphism, or accuse me of not understanding that anthropologists wish to understand human uniqueness as well as other things. So I'd like to just make a distinction at the beginning of this talk between human exceptionalism and human uniqueness. We certainly know that anthropology and evolutionary theory compels us to understand that humans constitute our lives uniquely. Every species constitutes its lives uniquely, from spiders to trout to groundhogs to humans. But what I am working on resisting and contesting is questions of human exceptionalism, that our way of doing society, language, technology is inherently superior. So the distinction between those 2 terms is fundamental for proceeding in this talk. I'd like to talk a little bit about my work in animal emotion, because I think some of the questions around human exceptionalism, anthropomorphism, and how we use language are seen very clearly in this work. I have been working in the animal grief realm for 10 years now, and I devised a definition that depends on a before and after evaluation of what survivors do when someone close to them dies. And this is, of course, in the animal world comprehensively. Do we see altered sleeping, feeding, and traveling behavior? Are there species-specific signals of distress in the body, the face, and the vocalization? And in order to be able to understand this, we need to know sort of baseline behavior with all its complexity of how an animal would normally act. So we know that there are abundant examples now of animal grief. One of the most prominent that is a touchstone for many people now happened 3 summers ago when the orca Tahlequah carried the body of her daughter on her own body for 17 days and 1,000 miles in the Salish Sea, which is part of the Pacific Northwest in the United States and British Columbia and Canada. This engendered a really global discussion about what we were seeing. And my claim is that Tahlequah's behavior met my criteria of grief, so that it isn't something as straightforward as stress about death, but rather an expression of her connection with her daughter by refusing to allow that body to fall into the ocean for 17 days. And here we saw all of this come into play with accusations of anthropomorphism, the question of human exceptionalism. Could orcas really do this sort of thing? And my answer is that based in the science of cetaceans, we can certainly say yes, there's an awareness of self and community, life and death in orcas that compels me to say that this behavior meets the definition of animal grief. We know, of course, that there are many examples in other mammals, for example, in elephants. When a matriarch collapses and dies, others may come and grieve at the body. And again, this grief can be shown by very specific emergent behaviors. So we are evaluating the animal's behaviors from the ground up rather than trying to read something about their inner thoughts. I have collected numerous examples of animal grief, including a cross-species stable of examples. Here is a donkey named Lena who was grieving at the grave of a horse that she bonded with for 3 years. After she viewed his death and his burial, she refused to come into the barn where she was living in a sanctuary for food, for water, or for any kind of comfort. She eventually did recover. But in all of these cases, I believe that it's scientifically rigorous to use words like grief and love to express what is going on. But again, this is not a fully accepted viewpoint. My suggestion is that animal grief doesn't depend on a concept of death, but it is embodied and it's non-verbal. It's its own phenomenon apart from a human standard. And I want to give an example of the type of response that this perspective is sometimes met with. There's a very interesting article in the journal Anthropology from several years ago about behavioral reactions toward death in collared peccaries. And the story behind this is interesting as well, because an 8-year-old boy was given a trail camera by his grandparents as a gift. He set it up behind his house in the desert here in the United States and was filming collared peccaries, which are, of course, pig-like animals. He then noticed that one of the herd had died and began to film the reactions of others, and took this film to his elementary school science fair, wherein happened to walk a mammalian biologist, and they together wrote an article for the Anthropology journal. What is very interesting to me is that they had very clear evidence to suggest that certain peccaries were acting in a way that was very different from their normal routine, that seemed to indicate emotional attachment to the body, and that met, again, my criteria for the expression of grief as opposed to the expression of stress. However, the authors chose to speak in this article only about response to death. Their language was fairly clinical. They even wrote that we cannot determine if there is grieving. I then wrote to the mammalian biologist who was the co-author on this paper, and she has given me permission to quote her response to me. This is Mariana Altucher. We wanted to say that we cannot with certainty say that the animals were grieving. We did not want to interpret the emotional aspect of this behavior and wanted instead to stick to the observable facts. However, I agree that their behavior meets a reasonable definition of grief for non-human animals. And this is very important. This is a microcosm of what is happening in the scientific community, where scientists still do not want to adopt words that they themselves believe are accurate in describing animal behavior, because they are really afraid of that A word, which is anthropomorphism, and accusations of anthropomorphism. And so we see this problem, and I do believe it is a problem, enacted over and over again. And my claim is that in fact, it is good science to use the word, to say the word, to go there, to say grief and love. And that when it comes to compassion, this is a barrier to having people understand the depth and complexity of animal lives if we are afraid to use the language that science should compel us to use. So here is a challenge and a barrier, I believe, to making that transition from studying animal cognition and emotion to really understanding that these animals are profoundly feeling their lives, which could be a motivation to expressing compassion. So my conclusion in the work that I have been doing is that grief and love is not human. This gets us back to the more than human world and the fact that we don't make the world meaningful ourselves. Thus, because animal grief and love are not human capacities, it can't be anthropomorphism. We are not projecting human qualities on other animals because we don't own those qualities. And I think that's an important starting point for how we think about language and the enactment of compassion. Of course, there are many people, and you all know a whole number of people working on these questions with language, with understanding how we describe other animal behavior, how do we motivate empathy, how do we motivate compassion. Laurie Gruen and John Gluck are just two examples of many. The second A in my list of three to describe myself is, of course, activist. And here is where we come to this question of when activism pulls in the same direction as anthropology and when it may pull in a different direction. And that is a challenge in itself. So in going around and speaking to different groups, this is US Capitol Hill on the top of the screen, and on the bottom right is giving my TED Talk in Canada. It is important to try to understand what my goals are, how I can talk across community differences, and how I can resist binaries in how I approach things. But it isn't always necessarily easy to move completely to an activist stance without thinking anthropologically about the state of the world. And I'll be giving some concrete examples as we go along. Of course, I don't want to make another binary that we don't need and oppose anthropology and activism. As Waterston and Corden say in their very beautiful graphic narrative book, there is a role for engaged anthropologists by asking, what can my discipline offer the world in order to address a wide range of issues of profound public importance? And often social justice for humans is considered at the top of the list. And what I'm asking is that one of these wide range of issues be animals and animal justice as well. The third A is, of course, an author. What I am attempting to do is broad public speaking, writing for broad audiences, and try to do so with opening myself up more than I have in the past. Here's a picture from 7 or 8 years ago where I am with a cat that we rescued after having gone through extensive chemotherapy and radiation. And my point in doing this is not to focus on myself, but rather to suggest that there are personal trajectories of enacting compassion that we all may experience, and that storytelling about them may be quite illuminating for the communities that we are trying to reach. This is an article I published last month in the online journal Psyche called "My Cancer Scars Map the Pain of Animals Held in Research Laboratories." And I will come back later and talk about Cornelius, who is a particular lab monkey held in Wisconsin, and talk a little bit about his story. If there are any students listening or later hear the recording, I just want to throw in a comment here that I still hear the term self-promotion being used as a kind of epithet, that we must not be self-promoters of our work. And I'd like to suggest that self-promotion is not a bad word if we're using it for galvanizing the public for animals. And it appears that I have in fact tweeted 29,700 times, mostly on animals. So I am out there trying to do this for animals. And in that particular vein, I am going to talk a little bit about the writing that I've done most recently. And to start talking about the 5 contexts that I mentioned to you a little more specifically, I want to read briefly from a start of my book. And this is an anecdote that is a way into thinking about compassion for animals in the home. About 10 years ago, I walked into the bathroom at home one evening and saw on the floor at the baseboard near our sink cabinet 2 enormous spiders. They simply sat there side by side. I felt they were staring at me. An irrational feeling? Maybe. Though astronomers and arachnologists later teamed up to announce that some spiders' vision is so terrifically acute that they can see the moon. Whether they could make me out or not, my coming upon these 2 startled me so badly. Their size, their stillness, their side-by-side doubling, that I fetched a shoe and beat the spiders to death and flushed them down the toilet. This incident has stayed with me because I am ashamed of what I did. And then I talk about how I was raised to fear insects and spiders, to kill them with tissues, to squash them in a moment. And I bring this up because this was a real turning point for me and made me think differently about compassion and about trans-species entanglements, because I thought to myself, what kind of animal person am I if I am going to simply squish spiders as a reactive mode? And I began to think, it's fine to enact compassion for the animals in our homes and to do our scholarly or community work to help animals at shelters or whatever way we choose to enact that. But if we don't see the animals around us and the little lives around us, we are not being comprehensive in our compassion. And this set me on a spider journey. And this is one of the ways that I found it important to sort of ease into the topic in the book. So I talk about meeting some spiders and challenging myself to come to learn these little lives as a way to think about the challenges that we all have in getting to know animals that we may be afraid of, and beginning to think really comprehensively. So again, the challenge is to think both individually and systemically about animals and about compassion. And I wanted to really live that. So here on the left is my first encounter with a salticid, a small jumping spider that I found quite charming and spent some time with. But I graduated eventually to spending time with the spiders that occur in this part of Virginia in the late summer and the early fall. These are orb weavers, and they are from the genus Argiope. So you see on the right, this rather large spider who set up shop outside my writing study window has retrieved some prey from her web and is about to eat it. And I found that spending time, just stilling myself and spending time and looking at these spiders opened up a whole new world for me. And I began to want not to kill them, but to understand them and to protect them. There was a large orb weaver spider that spread her web across our entire porch, and we put up a sign. This is in my husband's writing, and these are the 3 words I want on a t-shirt: don't bother spider. So that when people came to the porch to deliver packages, or really that was all that was happening during the pandemic, no visitors, we wanted them to know that there was a life here. And again, I find this to be a sort of toggle point, both between how to think about individual lives, that the lives of these spiders taught me something as I watched them weave and hunt and live, and also to think more symbolically, that they themselves are not symbols, but that they can lead us to think in different ways about animals. And I chose to start the book this way because I think that people can understand this and think about it in their own lives. I write about how understanding spider science can really explode our compassion for these animals, that storytelling about individual lives and the peer-reviewed social science of spiders can together be a powerful force. And again, this is a model for thinking about other things. So I wrote about the work in Costa Rica suggesting that spiders can do primitive numeracy. They can understand, I shouldn't even use the word primitive, they understand how to count prey on their web. I understand that they live their lives and think with their webs in ways that arachnologists have been working on. So that it is a fine thing to rescue spiders from the house as an enactment of compassion, but it also compels me to realize that sometimes taking a spider out of the house is not a rescue. And in fact, letting them live with you if they're not venomous is a perfectly reasonable response. So how do we think about the animals that are often relegated to this not cute category, right? People tend to rush to the cats, the dogs, the bunnies, the pandas. We're interested in the big brain mammals, the elephants, the chimpanzees, the orcas. But if we are going to think systemically, or if we're going to think ecosystemically, we need to be able to look at the cottonmouth snake and the possum and any other animal with eyes that are fully open. And again, language matters here. How many times have you heard the media say something like, there was a shark lurking in the waters of the Indian Ocean? And that verb lurking is very interesting. The other way to say it would be, there was a shark swimming in her habitat in the Indian Ocean. These choices that we make matter. And I recently signed a letter sent out to the Associated Press globally, suggesting that it would be a good thing if they stopped referring to animals as it in all of their stories, which we see over and over and over again. And sometimes it's easy for all of us to fall into that to refer to our dog as a he, and to refer to a snake like this as it. So this project, again, is to say, to think about the messages that we're giving each other and the messages that we're giving the people who listen to us and who read us. From that starting point of thinking about what the wild is and where we find the wild in our yards, in our balconies, what do we do when we find a spider, and does it, she, he belong inside or belong outside? I began to try to take on in the book some of the more perhaps profound systemic challenges. And of course, right among them is how we think of animals in relationship to food. And this is a topic that is, of course, central to many in animal studies and animal activism. And I'm going to read just a little bit here. I wish to underscore one conclusion that becomes increasingly clear month by month. It is a matter of urgency that people move towards plant-based eating in large numbers. Jane Goodall, a cherished voice of environmentalism and the world's foremost expert on chimpanzees, says as much. Goodall identifies 3 damaging factors of animal agriculture in addition to cruelty to animals. And then we discuss the destruction of wild lands, fossil fuels, pollution. But here is one of those places where it's fine to say that. It's fine to suggest that we need to be swimming in these waters. I mean, how many times has anyone here gone to, let's say, an animal shelter that is extremely invested in rescuing cats and dogs, and they may have a fundraiser and they serve chicken, pigs, and cows? I mean, there are things that we as a community need to talk about in terms of continuity of our compassion. But it's more than just being able to say, don't eat animals. And I want to expand on this a little bit. Some of you may know an amazing book by the anthropologist Alex Blanchette that came out in 2020 called Peccaries, American Animality, Standardized Life, and the Factory Farm. And only when I was reading that book did I understand fully and profoundly, really understand how it's so much more than only a question of animals being used for food. And he talks about the corporate pig. And this is from my book, and I will quote him. I knew already that pig parts are turned not just into pork chops, bacon, and sausage, but also into gelatin used in marshmallows, gummies, and Jell-O. But Blanchette's list of pig-derived gelatin products goes further. Photographic prints, makeup, other cosmetics, gel-based medical pills, sandpaper, waterproof fabrics, some wines, simulated mammal tissues for ammunition testing, material for culturing cells in laboratories, paper money, and possibly the pages of this book. Quoting Blanchette, radically dissembled pigs, unquote, are found not only in the food consumed by cats and dogs, but in asphalt on American highways. So Blanchette's conclusion, rather than simply refusing to eat meat, rather than simply refusing to eat meat, a basic demand should be the right to remain autonomous from the factory farm, not to be forced to subsidize these operations within our mundane actions. And so here I'm realizing that the problem is so comprehensive that we, of course, should talk about animals and food, but we also have to talk about the entire complement of how there are pig parts embedded in just every facet of our lives. And how do we, if we wish to do this, as I do, resist this and contest this? So in thinking globally about this question, here is a specific example of anthropology on the one hand, activism on the other, how they come together and how they pull apart. If we tell the world to go vegan, what does that mean to millions and millions of people who rely on chickens, pigs, cows to feed their families, who farm, who fish, people on the coasts of numerous countries and continents and locations? So there has to be some degree of sensitivity in suggesting that there's an urgency to this issue for animal suffering, for the planetary crisis that we're going through, the climate crisis, and at the same time be sensitive to the fact that we are not all in the same position, that we live in a world of global inequalities. And what I have begun to do is talk about the urgency of reducitarian eating. The term reducitarian is meant to encompass veganism, vegetarianism, plant-based eating, any kind of reduction. And this is not to suggest that I am downplaying the importance of veganism. I have learned a tremendous amount from vegan activists, and my heart is there, but rather to say that if we are to be effective in how we talk to the world about compassion for animals, there has to be an understanding, a situational understanding anthropologically of how the world is set up. So just as we resist binaries in other ways, for example, we are exploding binaries right and left quite correctly in gender. We know that the world is constituted of more than male and female. In food, we can take care to talk beyond binaries. We can resist the suggestion that I hear over and over again that you can be an omnivore or you can be a vegan. There are many, many, many degrees of approaching aspirational eating. And this is a way I think that can open up our compassion by suggesting that we're in a community together, making our best attempt for each of us in our situation, in our community, in our family, in our culture, for what we can do for animals. To be honest about this, I thought it would be important to situate myself on the food spectrum. Most of my meals are vegan. Not every product I put into my mouth is vegan. And this is why I describe myself as plant-based rather than vegan, because I understand the difference between those terms, one being a diet and one being a way of living. I aspire to the ideals of veganism. On the left, I have here plant-based fish and chips. On the right, I have plant-based just egg. And on top of my refrigerator, I have my obsession with plant-based, or rather non-dairy ice cream. But reducitarianism is a label that I embrace because I am not 100% perfect and pure about this. And I want to be able to talk to other people who are on this spectrum of aspirational eating. So there's so many ways to talk about animals in captivity that embrace what I've talked about already, but go beyond it. I'm going to be a little bit sensitive here to time and suggest that I'm very interested in talking about zoos if we have time in the question and answer session, but here I have only time to gesture towards talking about questions of captivity and compassion in that particular realm. I have a photograph here that's taken in the United States, in Florida. DAK refers to Disney Animal Kingdom, which is one of the parks in Orlando, Florida. And I chose this photograph particularly because when I was standing here looking at this captive gorilla, I noticed that there was a chance for him to hide himself from the human gaze, and that there are more and more zoo architects taking into account the fact that animals need to remove themselves from the human gaze. But here we come hard up against a difference between animal welfare and animal rights, because animal welfare wants to make the zoo enclosure a nicer enclosure for animals, and animal rights wants to suggest that the animal wants out of the enclosure. And here again, there are numerous conversations to be had that are in themselves complex and complicated. But I will suggest that there are things, again, that all of us can do. Here is the theme throughout, whether we're talking about animals at home, in the wild, animals as food, now animals in zoos, that we ourselves can very clearly speak up if we choose to attend a zoo. Try to close down roadside zoos, try to ask questions. We don't have to be a zoo abolitionist to do this. Again, I'm trying to work beyond binaries, to say something beyond the fact that either zoos are fine or zoos all have to be completely destroyed and shut down. Something to suggest that we can be part of a community to keep our eyes on these animals and to speak up. I'm going to quote from Bob Jacobs in the conversation last year. As my own research and work by many other scientists shows, caging large mammals and putting them on display is undeniably cruel from a neural perspective. It causes brain damage. I know a large number of people are working on this question, and I would add not only in terms of large mammals. And I just want to show very quickly a slide that is from Arnold Scheibel to suggest to you, without going through this in great depth, that there are lots of data behind this conclusion. This is not a conclusion that is based on ideology, but is rather based on neuroscientific fact in terms of the structure of the brain, the thinning of the cortex, the dendritic branching compared to one type of captive situation, another type of captive situation. And again, we could even go further and suggest versus no captive situation. And again, here is an opportunity to think about the fact that as people who have not only scholarly lives, but family lives, we may choose to take our children to a zoo because the animals living in them did not choose to be there. They are still fascinating. We can have eyes on them and speak up if we are concerned about how they are treated. And we can also work systemically to rethinking zoos and making them places where the animals in them are rescued animals, rehabilitated animals, local animals, animals that are needing help rather than there for our entertainment. I do want to make sure that I have time to talk about animals in biological laboratories because this has been a focus of my work recently. And here again, of course, we immediately come hard up against a divide in the scientific community and certainly even in the animal loving community. My suggestion is that we need to be much, much more aware of what is happening in biomedical laboratories with animals, and that this is very difficult because the biomedical community as a whole is not entirely interested, shall we say, in transparency. So in the book, I tell the story of flying out to a university in the United States Midwest to give a keynote talk several years ago, and walking through the campus, which was oriented in some parts towards animal agriculture, and coming up to a dairy research unit where cows were kept and finding a cow that looked like this. This was not the individual cow, but was what's called a fistulated cow, a cow with a porthole in her side. And these cows are found globally. They are research cows and experimental cows that are used for veterinary teaching. They are also used for research to track digestion and nutrition in cows. And they're also used in what's called transplantation, when people take the bacterial sort of material out of the vat of the digestive stomachs of the cow and give them to an ailing cow as a type of translocation of material to help a cow do better and be more healthy. But it struck me that this was a tremendous an opportunity to see a cow as an individual and understand something about her life, while at the same time thinking, talk about transparency. I mean, here is a literal attempt to make an interior body of an animal not only translucent and transparent visually to humans, but the ability for humans to invade that body with our hands whenever we choose by simply opening up that portal. And that struck me that that is what we do over and over and over again to animals in biomedical situations, who of course are unable to give their consent and in fact often speak with their bodies and their voices against consent. If you look at the websites of a number of biomedical advocates, we often see very sanitized images, such as this mouse being held rather gently in the hands of someone. You do not see the mice with their skulls open to have electrodes put in them or microscopes sewn into them or the other numbers of things that happens to animals in biomedical laboratories. And unlike the other contexts, here it is somewhat more challenging for people in some cases to think about, you know, what can we do about this if we are thinking comprehensively about compassion for animals? And one of the things that I do is storytelling about individuals. It's really hard to think about 75,000 monkeys in US laboratories alone. And of course, we multiply that greatly by the animals in global laboratories. It is easier, perhaps, although at the same time more heart-wrenching and more difficult, to think about individuals. And I have been writing and speaking about an individual named Cornelius, who I mentioned briefly before. Cornelius was born into the Wisconsin National Primate Research Lab in Madison, Wisconsin in the US in 2010 and has lived there ever since. At day 8, he was tattooed And so he goes by a number as well as a name. He is used frequently in biomedical experiments. He was raised with other young monkeys because he was rejected by his mother, but has been, for the most part, since 2010, if you count up the months and the years, caged alone. And I was able to review quite a lot of footage taken undercover by PETA activists of his confinement and a number of still photographs. And in this newspaper ad, which was taken out at a newspaper in the town where the biomedical research facility is, I concluded this monkey is embodying through his posture and through his gaze severe depression to the point of despair. That this animal has been allowed to continue in this state is indicative of extreme neglect, and the monkey is desperately in need of retirement. And I want to say here that as a cancer survivor, I don't think that it is incumbent upon me or anyone else who has benefited from animal medical research, which is, by the way, a question, and I'll come back to that, to say that just because we are a part of this system, we are therefore obligated to find it acceptable. And here is again that toggle between the individual and the systemic, because this is going on, of course, in laboratories across the country. And my suggestion is that if we are a community of animal studies scholars and animal lovers, co-constitutive community in some cases and separate in others, that it really behooves us to try to look beyond the attempt of the biomedical community to not be transparent and to realize that these lives are going on and to understand that it is possible to push for change. This is a quote from Fergausian et al. In a peer-reviewed article. Currently, animals are deliberately and commonly chosen for research as a result of their easy availability and manipulability, as well as institutional and cultural biases in society. Like human populations who were historically and systematically targeted, animals also have, quote, a frequently compromised capacity for free consent. And so when we think about this, again, the question becomes, well, what can we do if there's little transparency and if we're talking about extreme global systemic issues? And one thing that I think is important is to suggest that, first of all, we read the peer-reviewed science very, very carefully. And I was telling you all about this particular monkey because I felt that it was important to not just speak abstractly about monkeys in global laboratories. What I moved on to talk about for a while, not realizing no one was able to hear me, is the fact that we have awareness now that monkeys do not get coronavirus in the ways that we do. And dogs do not come down with muscular dystrophy in the way that we do. And mice do not get Alzheimer's disease. And yet these animals are still continuously used in laboratories with the claim that they're absolutely necessary to advances in science and human health. And when you actually look at the literature, the peer-reviewed literature, both in bioethics and animal science, consistently, the number comes out to between 92 and 96% of animal testing that does not advance human health, that the number of failures is statistically overwhelming. So I'm suggesting that just as we have specific opportunities to help animals in zoos, to help animals caught up in the food system, to help animals in the wild and in our homes, so we do also have opportunities to see the harms that continue in animal laboratories and make them part of how we think comprehensively about compassion for animals. So again, the theme being beyond the subjects that we work with and beyond our community work with certain animals, that we can be aware of this very large systemic issue. Just like with rethinking zoos or moving towards plant-based foods, there are things happening in the science world that are very exciting. And one of them is organs on a chip. And you may very well be familiar with this technology. These are very small chips that are about the size of a computer thumb drive. where it is possible to experiment on human cells and subject them to a number of environmental variables, environmental experimentation that bypasses the animal model route entirely. So this small piece of equipment has microfluidic chambers in which it is possible to embed cells of the lung, cells of the liver, cells of the stomach taken from humans, and then experiment directly, which is becoming very much a basis of a new emerging technology. And if we avail ourselves of knowledge about this technology and support it, and also read the fine print of methodology of what's happening in animal laboratories, I think this is a way to think of another avenue of compassion for animals. So I think it's probably a good thing for me to conclude at this point. And I want to conclude by saying that one of the very famous memes or tropes or themes that has emerged from animal activism is that animals are voiceless and we must speak up for them. And while I applaud the intention, here I wish to pull in a different direction and to suggest that animals are not voiceless at all. That in all of the contexts that I have been talking about, all 5 of the contexts and more that you can all imagine, we can look at animals and understand that they have good days and bad days, and that they are telling us in their species specific ways which are which. They are very, it is very possible to read them in a scientific way by looking from the ground up at what they are doing, how they are acting, and what they are telling us. And I think this compels us to at least consider the fact that harms can be turned into opportunities, and that trans-species entanglement is very much of an issue of social justice. So I hope that this gives you some idea of the types of things that I've been working on that I hope are sort of a lead in to some of the exciting work that's coming up in the hours and the days to come. So I did attempt to recover from that small panic in the middle, and I hope that I did so, and I'd like to now answer any questions that may arise.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for this inspiring presentation and for coming back to us and completing it and getting back on the horse. And please use the raise hand button, and then we can unmute you and you can comment or ask a question or whatever you would like. I will use the time to just say that the last couple of days we've been experiencing a lot of contact with spiders and cockroaches, various ones of us here on the team, and we were wondering what it meant. And I think it's clearer to me now that the cockroach jumping on me and the spider sitting on me were just ways of preparing me for your presentation. So.
Thank you. Well, I'd be very delighted to hear any thoughts, whether they come in the form of comments or questions. Oh, what does this mean? Have I just, was this, I don't know. I don't know what this means. I've never had no questions before.
Well, give people a minute to process everything that you've been talking about, and I'm sure there'll be a few. Oh, okay. I have now 2 participants who have raised their hands, so let's see who they are and unmute them. Just 1 second. Okay, so let's start with Sue.
Yes, can I speak now?
Yeah.
Yes, I just want to say you did a wonderful job, Barbara, and you raised so many positive, constructive things that can be done, and I'm very grateful for that. I'm wondering if you think that there are any kind of important species differences among non-humans, or if you feel that they are all perhaps guided by some level of universal intelligence, that as we become more sensitive to them, we will also become more sensitive to that ourselves.
Well, first of all, thank you, Sue. It's nice to hear from you. And thank you for all your work over the years, including work that helped me in my career. And I think it's a very interesting question. I don't know about universal intelligence. I think I'm more of a particularist than that, but I do think that my work, which is in very informal, personal work with spiders, has led me to realize that there are all kinds of animal intelligences. And so, yes, I think there are different levels and degrees and expressions of intelligence, but that there are just so many unanswered questions, especially about the invertebrate world. Right now, the octopus is having his or her moment, right? With my octopus teacher winning all sorts of awards globally, coming out of South Africa, and having people understand a little bit more about invertebrate intelligence, but this extends also to spiders and insects. And I think it's really important to do what we normally do as scientists, to look at these animals in their natural habitats and build from the ground up what they are doing and try to understand their intelligence. So I want to use the word comprehensively and broadly, but perhaps not universalist in its particular instantiation, since we're dealing with so many different niches and so many different species. I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you.
Pablo?
I am not hearing the speaker.
There it is. Now, yes, because they were unmuting it, so that's okay. Thank you very much for the talk, Barbara. I really enjoyed it, and there are so many overlaps with our research. I didn't know about animals' best friends, so I'm looking forward to reading it. My question was, there was a moment that you mentioned, because my research relates to this, and I wondered what you thought, that you said that grief does not depend on having a concept of death. It is an embodied response, which I sort of agree with that statement in part, but what I try to say in my work is that our embodied responses are, in a way, intrinsically conceptual. So if one thinks, for example, about, I don't know, we are walking on the street, right, and we feel the breeze touching us, something like that, we feel the breeze conceptually. So we identify breeze, as it were. When we touch water, through our touch, we identify water as water, and that's conceptual. But in the way that you were phrasing that, when I say conceptual, by the way, I don't mean the cognitive sense of conceptuality, human law-centric kind of thinking. I think I'm talking more of an animal conceptuality, as I call it in my work. But you seem to kind of make a clear divide. But I suppose when you mean concept of death, you mean more the sort of cognitive, humanist or anthropocentric understanding of concept of death. I was just, because you were mentioning so much that the language we use is so important. In a way, what I'm trying to do in my work is to reclaim the concept of concept. I'm trying to say animals exist conceptually in the world, and we humans are animals. Like we share that concept, shared conceptual space, as it were. And well, it's just a thought, perhaps, or a comment. And I wondered what you thought. But yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I love the idea of reclaiming the concept of concept and making it comprehensive and making it, throughout the animal world. I like that very much. And yes, my language was, I believe, a bit imprecise, because I was speaking about how so many people define grief as requiring a moment of cognitive awareness in the human sense of death. And that is what I was pushing back about. So for example, if I give an anecdote, this is a zoo-based anecdote. This comes from gorillas. There were two gorillas who were housed together, a male and a female, and they were housed as a pair, which of course would not occur in the wild, but they did have a deep emotional bond over years. And the female contracted cancer, and after attempts to help her, it was determined that she needed to be put down humanely because she was suffering. At this point, the male was allowed to spend time with the female's body, which I think is quite a good advance that many veterinary practices and zoos and sanctuaries are doing, rather than just having the animal, sort of whisked away and then the second animal brought in and there's nothing and just left with no closure. So the male gorilla walked to his partner, his friend, tried to rouse her, even tried to put her favorite food in her hand. And at this point, he looked again, turned away from the body, let out a wail, banged the cage bars, and never attempted to rouse her again. And I thought about that a lot, because that is some kind of a transformative moment for that animal. How do we understand that? And what I don't want to do is to suggest that there was necessarily a human-like moment of a concept of death. And that's what I'm pushing back about. But here, I think perhaps if I could say, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, here is another chance to think about concepts, because there is an embodied response of touch from one animal to the other. There's a recognition at some very profound level that there's some tremendous change here. And then the animals showed this transformation by his own choice to change his behavior. Do you see what I'm saying? So I agree very much with what you're saying.
Yes, and I agree very much with what you are saying. So I think we're on the same page on this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and if it is possible for us to connect later, I would like to do that. If we could find each other. Oh, okay, thank you.
Fantastic, thank you.
Anu?
So, hi, Barbara. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I'm joining in from India, and what you mentioned about aspiring to be somewhere on the scale of, omnivore or carnivore and somewhere in between, vegan or vegetarian, is something that has implications for the reality in India too, where there is a large number of people who eat meat, and this practice of eating meat or of consuming other animal products is also linked very closely to certain cultural practices which are connected in turn to certain caste-based identities, for example. I speak from the perspective of someone who's been vegetarian since the age of 5 by choice, but also I happen to have been born into a caste that forbade the eating of meat, so it was not really like I had to rebel against the thing in that sense. But I completely understand in that sense people who, for whom it is a matter of asserting their identity to be consuming animal products, and then they're being told by the dominant caste that it's not okay to do so. And from that perspective, I wondered what you thought of the whole idea and the movement towards artificial meat that's coming up now. Is that in that sense a viable alternative? Is that a possibility of going on with doing what one has always done, and trying to be more just, trying to be more humane towards the non-human animals in the world?
Thank you for your comment and your question. And I think your example of this caste class system is a very good motivation for me to continue to support cultured meat and cellular meat, which I actually do. And I know that that is a controversial thing to say in some circles. So I'm sure most of you know about this, but what we're talking about is meat that is constructed from animal cells, but not involving animal slaughter. So there is a way to extract animal cells and build meat that then allows people to actually be eating meat that is not plant-based, that is animal-based, but is not involving slaughter. I have so many thoughts about this, and I've written about this at some length, both in the TLS and in my book. I have a certain resistance to thinking that technology is going to save us. You know, I think that there's a very sort of, in some ways, a very Western, commitment to thinking that our problems will all be solved by technology. But I also think that this is a tool in a toolbox that can be an important complement to other approaches as well. Now, I know that in the beginning, a lot of these products were made with fetal bovine serum, which immediately makes it problematic for people who don't want to consume products that contain that sort of item. And a lot of companies are moving away from that and are using, just a very, very few starter cells that are harvested in a humane way for animals. And I think that this again gets back to the exploding binaries issue, right? That there are lots and lots of omnivores in this world who are not going to become vegan for any number of complicated reasons. And if we give them another path towards avoiding animal slaughter, I think that is positive. I have hesitations in certain ways about the corporate nature of this, but that's probably for another day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat and then a couple of raised hands. So we'll try to get to all of these. So Carlos asks, what about research about animal cognition? I'm working in EAAT field and we're in discussion about training or qualification of equine.
Okay, I think I need the question rephrased. I don't know that I understand it.
So we'll ask Carlos to rephrase. And in the meantime, Francine Dollins asks, how best can we teach students about the use of anthropomorphism in science?
Yeah, I think it's really important to distinguish, as many people before me have, including Jane Goodall, Franz Duval, and others, that there are different types of anthropomorphism. And there's critical anthropomorphism, this is a term Gordon Burkhardt coined, I believe, where we are actually understanding that because we are all animals, we are going to have, in some ways, a very likely similar outlook to the world, and that we can ask other questions that don't start by coming up with this human exceptionalist divide. So in other words, it's possible to marry anthropomorphism with very critical scientific observation of animals, that the anthropomorphism can be a starting point for questions for a particular understanding, but not the end point. So you don't draw conclusions because you're assuming that animals feel as we do, but you're asking, well, you know, what I think I see looks a lot like dog jealousy. Could this really be dog jealousy? And let's devise ways of participant observation with dogs to find out, or non-invasive experimentation to find out. So that if students understand that it's a way of looking at the world that really privileges a sort of unity among animals, but then asks the science to develop the differences, perhaps that is a good way to put it. I also think it's important for students to read what Franz Duval talks about, which is anthropodenial, that everybody worries about the, being scientifically non-rigorous because of anthropomorphism, but it's just as likely we're going to be scientifically non-rigorous if we deny our common behavioral, emotional, and cognitive roots with other animals. So it's all in how you do it.
Okay, great. Fran.
Okay, so this is a question about equines, and it involves animal cognition and equines. Could the person possibly unmute himself so we could talk? Is that possible?
Carlos?
Because I'm eager to answer the question, I just need to understand it better.
Okay, I see Carlos. Hi.
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 Good evening, and thanks for this opportunity. I'm working in the EAT field, and I have been just working on in a meeting about training equines for EAT, and we have this discussion about qualifying equines, like as you qualify humans to do some type of activity or some type of job, or train the equines. So, and we've said that there are still lots of research missing, lack of research. And my question was if you know more like research about equine cognition or animal cognition.
Okay, thank you. So EAT is equine assisted therapy.
Yeah,
this is
equine assisted activities and therapy, yes.
Okay, so this is not an area in which I'm expert, but there's a lot of research about the ability of equines to follow human cues and understand and respond to humans that exists in the journal Animal Cognition and others like that. I do think that there's a long history, of course, of animal-horse communication, and I would say co-regulated communication, so that the communication is dynamic and is co-constructed between the two species. I think that the cognition is out there. I don't feel very I would like to answer this question. I don't feel very comfortable answering it because it's just not something that I've spent a lot of time with. I know that there's a range of attempts to use animals in therapy. For example, I'm a little bit more familiar with the use of dolphins in therapy, and there's a lot of ethical pushback about that. So this is an area with a lot of angles, and I think I would want to read more about it before I ventured an answer. So I'm sorry about that.
Okay, thank you. That's true. It's really a complicated question also, because there are like lots of different perspectives about different professionals, and some say train, some say qualify, some understand the sentience of the equines or animals, and it's a little bit it's challenging, but I really feel that we should talk about qualifying equines instead of being them be the best version of themselves. So I'm just young people.
I see where you're going there, because I often talk with people about the use of, let's say, dogs in different ways. I'm sure this is going to be discussed at this conference by people more knowledgeable than I. Dogs as service dogs are, what is appropriate, what allows them to be dogs and express their dogness, versus something like horse racing, which I think for me is ethically much less complicated, as I don't think that horse racing is something that I wish to support. So the idea of looking at the essence of an animal and understanding what it is that they want to participate in, I think is really the heart of this conversation. Being able to look at them without imposing what we wish they would like to do, and seeing, what their choices are. How much choice are we giving them? Rather than, if we only give them two choices and they pick one, we decide that that's what they want to do. It's very complicated. And thinking about really the autonomy of animals, their ability to express their consent, and our ability to recognize what consent would look like. I would have a chance of recognizing consent in horses and in dogs. I wouldn't have an idea in spiders or an octopus.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's very difficult and challenging, but we are walking that path, and it's challenging. It's really challenging because but we're walking there. So
okay.
Thank you, Carlos. We will now try Fran. Fran, you need to unmute.
Yeah. Hi, thank you so much. I think that the silence at the end of your talk was because you had so beautifully wrapped up. It was so comprehensive that it was kind of stunning. Where do we start? And so my question to you is, how did you put together your 3 A's? Where did you start? And if you would tell us a little bit more about entering animal studies through anthropology, I think it would be really helpful. Did you go from anthropology to activism that way or the other way around? Or could you just give us a little bit more insight into how you put together this amazingly comprehensive package and your brilliant career?
Oh, well, thank you. And first of all, I have to admit, I did panic when I burst out with, I've never had this before. And that's just because it was a little unsettling having to go off the computer and back on the computer. And I just had to get myself back. And so as a teacher, I have always, taught other younger teachers, just sit and let the questions emerge. And boy, I didn't do that. So anyway, thank you for understanding why.
But we're all humans, and we're all animals, and we all have reactions.
Yes, right. So I'm not panicking anymore. I did start out very much as a primatologist in a context of biological anthropology, but I was taught this was the very late 70s and early 80s, that the pinnacle of animals are the animals most like us, that chimpanzees, orangutans, gorillas, monkeys, have the highest animal cognition and the deepest emotional expression. And I kind of bought all that for a while. So I went off to Kenya to study baboons and really wanted to be a scholar of non-human primates. Interestingly, I got to Kenya in Amboseli to study baboons through being rejected by the Rwandan government. I had won a National Science Foundation grant to go study with Diane Fossey, and the government of Rwanda did not allow me to come in because my work was not conservation oriented. So I retooled and I went to Amboseli. But I started in Amboseli surrounded by beautiful, wonderful animals of many species to start to think beyond other primates. And so there was an iterative change. I began to really want to read about other big-brained mammals. So I was reading about elephants, I was reading about whales and orcas. And then the more I read about the more range of animals, the more I began to see that I've been put in a box. It wasn't necessarily anthropocentrism, which is putting humans at the center. It was primate centrism, putting primates at the center, then mammals. And everything began to fall away because every animal that I read about had some way of expressing himself or herself in the world that seemed to me intelligent and emotional. And then after a certain point, and this happens to so many scientists, I just realized that I wanted to work for animals. And so that came later. The activism came later, when I didn't want anymore just to report what animals were doing, but to say, I am part of this problem. This I hope comes across with some degree of humility, because I realized that I was part of what was hurting other animals, and that we can only do what we can do in terms of aspire to do better. So my feeling now is that whatever we eat, we are causing some harm. Whatever we do, we are causing some harm. And the idea is not to get to the point where we do no harm, but to think about everything, to work as we can day by day for all animals. And that took a really, really long time.
Thanks so much. It seems to me that in this generation, that a lot of people are entering animal studies already kind of committed to be activists, and then they need the scientific background. It's fascinating to hear the different entry points and where it leads to, and your work is just really inspiring.
Thank you. When my dissertation committee told me that I was to express my findings about Amboseli baboon learning in statistics, that what we wanted to understand was what the average baboon infant was doing. And at the time, I was reading Barbara Smuts, I was reading Jane Goodall, and I was saying, I'm really not interested in the non-existence, the mythical average infant baboon. And, I had to jump through some hoops and produce a statistically oriented dissertation to then be able to free myself and to think that qualitative science is the way that I wanted to go. And one of the first interviews I did as a young professor actually had a quote in the article about me, which was suggesting that the qualitative work was not science. And I began to realize that this was part of a much bigger discussion, and that I really wanted to work on individual animals' expression in the world, as well as connecting that to ecosystemic issues.
Well, our time is up, but Eva's been waiting patiently. If you could both just make it very brief, because we really have to wrap things up.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so I'll try to be very brief. First of all, Barbara, thank you so much for your fascinating and inspiring talk, and also especially for stressing throughout your talk the importance of language and how we use it to speak about animals, but also how we speak about speaking with animals. And my question is sort of related to that, but in the sense of outreach. So it goes towards the activism side of things, but also as scholar activists or scientist activists, like what would be, from your experience, what would be your recommendation, your advice, how as scholars or scientists we should go about? Can you still hear me?
Okay, you froze at the end. I did hear most of the question.
Okay, great. So basically, how can we communicate it to people outside of science, outside of academia, to make them care? Basically?
Yeah. For me, the answer revolves around storytelling, and that's something that I tried to emphasize through the talk. For example, when I said, it's hard to motivate people to think about 75,000 monkeys, let's talk about Cornelius. And I do the same thing when I talk about animals in zoos, through photographs, through examples of personal experience, personal narrative, opening up the discussion, and then beginning to connect, what you can do for one animal to what you can do for all the animals that are behind. So I think that learning to write and to speak for the public has been something that has been a long, long journey for me. And something that I like to tell students is that when I submitted my first book for the public, I was very proud of it, but I didn't talk to my editor about the struggles I had. And the first thing he said to me was, nice book, but let's go back and rewrite it for the public. And I realized that it is, for me at least, speaking for me, hard to move from an academic sort of presentation to a public presentation without a lot of thought. And storytelling is a way to do that, a way to ease into that. And then, to think again about our language, because the numbers of jargon that we use very, very unconsciously is really quite immense. So, it's wonderful for us to come together and talk about trans-species entanglements. But, if you go out to talk to a group of people who aren't in academia, you better well explain what that means. I just want to say, because I know that we're running out of time and it's not fair to keep talking when other people are waiting in the wings. If there are questions that people didn't get to, please look for my website, because there is a way to contact me. So it's easy to find. It's barbarajking.com. You can find it on the internet. I'm also highly active, as you saw earlier, on Twitter, where my name is bjkingape, A-P-E. And I do answer follow-up questions to the best of my ability through either. And I really want to thank you for listening. And I will be popping in and out through the next 3 days. And so I will be seeing some of you again, but thank you so much for your attention and again for the invitation. And Dafna, a particular big shout out of thanks to you for all these months of conversation and preparation.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara, for starting off our conference in such a positive and really interesting and captivating way. And there were more questions, so I hope they will find a way to reach you. And we will now take a 9-minute break and rejoin here to continue our day with a panel on challenges in time and space. So thank you all very much, and see you in just a few minutes, I hope.